Essentially, yesterday when we started this meeting, we had our friend from India made some very interesting remarks about contextualizing the whole business of evaluation and how does it really fit into the current and important questions that the world is asking. And there are lots of questions people are asking in terms of where does it, how does it help nation building? What kind of impact does it have over democracy and other things, which I think are critical questions to answer. So what I've done is that I have tried to build a sort of a link first in the context of what we are operating in, I'm not going to read most of it because you already know some of these things in terms of how Philippines is. Just to let you know, one of the critical things that we identified in the Philippines when we were starting off this country program was the huge amount of human security deficit that we have noted. And that has to do with Philippines' proneness to disasters. You just heard recently about the Haiyan and Yolanda. And then insecurity issues with ongoing insurgencies. The big tensions between China and the US and South China Sea. So there's a huge amount of security issues that surround development in the Philippines. And of course, some of this has to do with also, despite a very high amount of growth rate, Philippines still has not been able to reduce its poverty, and it is very important, something to note, very critical. I just wanted to also point out that after Shiv Kumar made those comments yesterday about relationship between democracy, growth, and accountability, I remembered one of the recent researches that have been done about relationship between democracy, growth, and inequality. And I just wanted to throw it out to you, to some of you, as to what do you think would be the relationship between democracy and growth and democracy and inequality. Would democracy be good for growth? If I can have a show of hands. Economic growth? It depends, okay. What about democracy and inequality? It depends. Okay. Well, if I asked you to get you into yes and no, then what would you say? Yeah. Okay. 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 Right.
But like our take on democracy produces really the growing inequality.
Yes,
And
yes,
even
yes.
US democracy is producing a growing inequality in states. So I think it depends. So
Okay.
I wouldn't say that democracy doesn't automatically bring you the
Equality.
equality
Okay.
and economic growth.
I would say democracy and inequality in terms of political uh, inequality can be accountable, but not in terms of social inequality. Democracy doesn't address social inequality that well. So I would give no as an answer
Okay.
between a yes and a no.
Good. That's, yeah, sorry, please.
Just about democracy and growth, there's been a recent thesis advanced that growth is good for democracy. I'm not sure about the other way around,
Okay.
but yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so there was a recent review by two Harvard economists. I think many of you may have heard about them. They just recently, last year, wrote a book called Why Nations Fail. And it's James Robinson and H. Muglu. And in a recent review, they have shown with a lot of statistical analysis, and of course, it can go either way depending on how you look at statistics. But they say that yes, democracy is good for growth, but democracy does not really address inequality. And actually, there's a negative relationship to a certain extent. So I think that we need to look at that. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I think that in many cases, and for example, I come from Philippines and I originally come from Pakistan. And in both cases, we have had, of course, some experiment democracy, which has not really been very well for inequality. And in the Philippines, certainly in the last 3.5 years that I have seen, although the country is growing at 7% growth rate, which is one of the highest in the ASEAN countries, yet it remains to not be able to answer inequality. And I think part of the reason is what I write here is one of the things that we believe inherent in democracy is the whole issue of accountability and institutions of accountability. And of course, you may have political accountability by one party being thrown out by another party after 5 years, but the issue is what are the other mechanisms of accountability that strengthen democracy? And you may have heard, of course, there's of course a whole judicial system, but there are independent mechanisms within the constitution in many countries where you have an ombudsperson who you could refer to in case the judicial system also fails you. You also have somebody like an auditor general who by constitution is protected from the executive to a certain extent in terms of holding public servants accountable. But you really do not have anything on programmatic part of accountability. And that is where I believe evaluation is a very important part to fulfill its role in terms of programmatic accountability. That has to do with the integrity of the planning instruments in the government, which has to do with many of the development issues. And of course, development as a right is also very important. So I believe that we can look at evaluation and therefore the capacity building for evaluation as an instrument of strengthening accountability processes in civil society and the country. Next. One of the things that has consistently worried me, and I mentioned it yesterday in the in-draft evaluation process also, is that in many cases our programs do not really have a good theory of change or what I call evaluability built in them. And when you go after 5 years, you start realizing actually you can't really evaluate this program because it never had a good story behind it in the first place. And so when we started this work, and I must say that this is a work in progress, one of the things that we considered was to look at what is implicit theory of change and what is an explicit theory of change. Implicit because in some cases you can't discuss some of these things with public servants and the people you work with because of its sensitive nature, and in some cases you are bringing up issues which may not be entirely acceptable to be discussed in a public forum. So I must say that one of the interesting things that I have paid attention to is these three things when we were doing some of this initial work, is to look at values, process, and institutions. And of this, most important is the values. When you go into something like this, what is the value that the public servants and you yourself carry into this kind of work? And in many cases, I think that you are dealing with, in some cases, a dichotomy of what is manifest value and what is an implicit value or implied value. When we work with the government servants, also I must say that I include myself in it, there are many incentives that we work for. And I must say that many of us work as professionals and not altruistic. So the question is, what is it that we carry with us in terms of action to working with the public servants? And while public servants work with us, the question is, what are they doing? What are they doing it for? And are they just doing it because they're public servants, or there are some other advantages to what they're doing right now? And so there is a difference between values which are manifest in interaction and what is implied in the interaction. The second thing that we have talked about since yesterday also is the whole issue of demand and supply. And I will just refer to this again. Is accountability something in demand? It's probably not. In most cases not, but in some cases, you may actually have good leaders who may want to be held accountable and would use it to their political advantage. And I can give you an example from the Philippines. And the third thing is institutions. At least from UNICEF's side, I can say with some confidence that UNICEF has not looked at capacity building dimension in terms of institution building. And so in most cases, UNICEF treats capacity building in the middle tier, which is a process, and we train some people and we believe that's capacity building. And that's not really capacity building, because actually you have to make people and the systems capable to use that capacity in the first place. So there is an added dimension of capability. The next slide. So in terms of real practice or action that I showed you the process in the middle yesterday, just in the previous slide, I just want to say that this is the explicit theory of change that we have. And this builds on something like a Tanahashi model of 10 determinants or 10 bottlenecks that they have discovered in the health field, which have to do with enabling environment, supply, and demand. And these are usually 10 classified in the Tanahashi model for health sector. But we have tried to apply this to capacity building of evaluation. And in this case, certainly enabling environment has to do with having a very good national evaluation policy. And this also has to do with the domain of strategic intent. What does the public sector want it to do, want it from the evaluation process? Second is supply, and one of the major and most important things that we believe is critical to do is to create the demand through creating sort of more of a civil society action along with the public sector and these networks to be able to create a demand for something like this from experts and public sector. And we are mostly supply driven, so in most cases that's the easiest thing to do, and we do refer more to the supply part of the evaluation work. And essentially it is the fact that you have to impart competency-based training to public servants and institutionalize some of the M&E monitoring and evaluation units in the departments that are interested in undertaking evaluation. I'll discuss some of the complexities that we have encountered and still encounter in terms of how we want to deal with them a bit later. Next. So this is just to illustrate to you, and this is not a show and tell, it is work in progress. But essentially we have been able to do a lot of things on the policy issue. We have found a very receptive government, and that's to our advantage. We have set and worked with the National Economic Development Authority, which is the highest planning institution in the government, and we have worked with the Department of Budget, two hierarchical institutions which enjoy a lot of power in the government, to develop something which is sort of an independent, and I put it in inverted commas, how independent it is, because as we know, just having a business process changed does not really make it independent. The question is, ultimately we want to really go back to the level of the constitutional process where we could actually enshrine evaluation as a part of independent process, like the auditor, like the issue of ombudsperson, who can be who can be really independent in terms of holding people accountable. So we have developed principles and norms which are in accordance with international standards. We have also included legal and budgetary support, institutional arrangements, and of course the standards and ethics. And the whole policy is now being put together, and would hopefully is to a certain extent finalized, but we want to take it to the highest level in terms of perhaps through the presidential office to be able to endorse it and then put it into practice. And that is a bit ambitious, because if you wanted to keep it at the departmental level, it's pretty easy to put, but we need to really raise the bar in terms of its independence. So essentially the policy environment gives us a legal foundation to make evaluation mandatory, and also the capacity building for it mandatory in the Philippines. Next. So one of the things that we found easy to do, and we went ahead and did it, was to work with several departments to see if there is an interest in building monitoring and evaluation units within departments. And then we identified a cadre of people who could be assigned to these monitoring and evaluation units, and then be trained in terms of what they need to do to build competencies in how to run those monitoring and evaluation units. Now the question essentially is, where do these monitoring and evaluation units report to? And if they report again to the old structure, then obviously their independence is compromised and there is really no point in having them. So that is the part of the riddle that we are still working with. We have to really look at what would be the reporting relationship of these units, whether they should report to the secretary of the department, which is the minister or the top level in the ministry, or should that be reported to a vertical structure within the government that should be independent of the ministry. And those are the things we are still debating, and that's going to be a bit of a struggle. And of course, we have worked in detail with the departments to develop their job descriptions and to see and to have a full government buy-in into that process. Next. And then again, of course, one of the things that we try to do, and we're still pursuing it, is to try and convince some of the more high caliber international universities to go into a partnership with the Philippines Civil Service Academy, and to see if they can actually become a focus of imparting this capacity building and capacity development work within the Philippines. And we've worked partly with Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, and hopefully will increase the number of universities. But even within the Philippines, we have several universities who would be interested in this kind of a public-private partnership process, and would be able to impart some of the training to the Civil Service Academy, which becomes nucleus of carrying this forward and making it a part of the civil service reform process. One of the things that is of personal interest to me is, how do we really institutionalize this at the local government level? Yesterday when we were talking at the panel, I had mentioned that, and somebody else also said this to me yesterday, when he came to a session on decentralized evaluation, he was thinking that actually he will be talking about decentralized units of governance and those units of governance being evaluated, and actually turned out that it was evaluation itself which was being decentralized. But I was more interested in evaluation being done at the local level. And in some cases where we have large countries, federal structures, a lot more sense goes into what can you do at the subnational level. And certainly in case of India, in case of Pakistan, in case of the Philippines, a lot more learning takes place at the local level, and how that learning can be brought up to the policy level and then be allowed to make a change in national policy is a very critical part of work. And so we are working with a non-governmental organization that runs a mentorship program for mayors in the Philippines. And mayors, by the way, are municipal level executives, and Philippines has about 1,500 of them, so there's a lot of them. And the Philippines model of decentralization is extremely complicated. But one of the interesting things about it is that it does operate on a very high level of principle of subsidiarity, which is that the municipalities are quite independent in what they do. But the sheer number of them basically makes it very daunting in terms of how we can actually work at that level. But our program model is essentially to work with few of them and then see if they can inspire others to basically copy that model or not. So we will be working with some of the mayors to put it in the mentorship process when they are chosen or elected as mayors and coming into the office. They're taken to a 2 or 3 week course by the Civil Service Academy in terms of mentorship. And if we can include monitoring and evaluation as a part of that mentorship module, then I think we probably will have some success. Next. So here are some recommendations. Then they may appear to be some appear to be naive, and some may be irrelevant to all of your national situations. But that is what I could cull out what I thought was critical for us, what we learned from the Philippines. I was just saying that one of the things that I find very interesting is, and the question that I have consistently studied in the Philippines is, how can you really make good social performance a good political agenda? And working with some of the local mayors, we have realized that actually giving them information, getting them to understand what they need to do in the next couple of years in terms of their social indicators, and then letting them understand where they are and empowering them with more information actually helps them to align their political agenda with their social performance. So that if a mayor is able to demonstrate actually objectively that they have done well in social indicators in their municipality, and he can get independent verifiable information of that performance, then it is really good for their political agenda to be re-elected in the next 3 years. So the question is, alignment of incentives is very critical. How do you align political and social and cultural incentives in the same line so that things work seamlessly? The second thing I want to say, this is more for UNICEF actually, because I believe that from UNICEF side, we are not really engaged with the government, and our level of dialogue is not sophisticated enough sometimes for the governments to be interested in. So if you only talk about capacity development, that's not very interesting, because the government thinks, okay, you're bringing in $50,000, you want to train 50 civil servants, go ahead and do it. But the question is, if you want to really involve high-level intellectual leadership and academic leaders and people of some accomplishment in terms of being at the ministerial level in these large countries, you really need to capture their imagination by increasing the sophistication of your dialogue. And so essentially, some of the things that we have to do for ourselves is to situate our own effort and our own intentions in a more complex environment. And it's not enough to say you want to do capacity building because you think capacity building is good. It is important to say, how does capacity building really address inequality? Capacity building for evaluation, for example, how does it help accountability? How would it help the government to perform better in the next 4 or 5 years? Those are the larger questions that have to be addressed. And then one of the pragmatic things is to determine what is independent enough. You have to start somewhere, and you will not get to the constitutional amendment in the next couple of years. But you put the seed, and then you start looking at how do you really get to the highest level, including the involvement of the executive and the president. And then the other things I think are pretty standard, so I would not go into them. Next. Now the challenges. I think this is perhaps the most important part of the presentation. And that is the fact that we've found that when we are dealing with the departmental level, we usually run into very serious interdepartmental politics. And that has to do with the fact that if UNICEF is working with one department, why doesn't UNICEF work with another department? And why is aid flowing into one of the departments and why not coming to another one. And that has to do with, I think, to a certain extent, what Elinor Ostrom calls in one of the most well-known evaluations I think she has done. And for some of you who may not know her, she is, I think, one of the only social scientists, but probably a sociologist actually, who got a Nobel Prize in economics. She did a very interesting evaluation of SIDA projects, and she talked about the perverse incentives that aid brings to host countries. And what she talks about is the fact that in many cases, when aid comes into the countries, the accountability processes are distorted. So that, for example, a departmental secretary or a departmental officer actually becomes accountable to me as a donor and does not remain accountable to a certain extent to his or her own hierarchy. A mayor who is given aid by UNICEF actually becomes accountable to me rather than being accountable to his own municipal council or what they call Sanggunian in the Philippines. And the issue is that if you really do not pay attention to this perverse incentive or distortion of institutional accountability, you are going to be doomed from the very beginning because it's not going to be sustainable in the long run. The moment you pull out, it's going to fall apart. So I think that's a very important part. And interdepartmental politics has really been a difficult one for us to handle in the Philippines. The second thing I want to say is that evaluation is generally seen as I have been saying, accountability, and to a certain extent, very similar to audit function. And somehow we have to change this view or image, although we need to keep it, of course, it's very important, but it is also important to take it to highlight the learning side of it, which I think is what people really want. I think that's an innate, sort of desire to keep learning. I think there should be an innate desire to be accountable also, no? There is, yes? Okay. I just wanted some confirmation. Yes, but I think that it is not very well developed. Learning is perhaps a bit more developed, so we need to pay focus to the learning incentive part of it. In many countries, there is a lot of what I also call, to a certain extent, witch hunting that goes on. Sometimes people are doing good work and newspapers take them on for something else and try to tarnish their image. And so to a certain extent, sometimes accountability is also perverse, and it does damaging work also. And as I said, within the context of a middle-income country, I think it's very important to look at what can we do in a middle-income country. UNICEF is struggling with this question more and more as we try to phase out of our low-income country, UNICEF-driven model. Because in many countries, what we have done is we have become, to a certain extent, service provider and supply providers. And it is still, to a certain extent, suitable in many low-income countries, although I would still question that. But certainly in case of emergency, it is very important. But in case of middle-income countries, the question is, how do you really diagnose and understand the institutional context of a country and see where can you work with those institutions to be able to get them to see what is important for them, rather than imposing yourself and your own values on them. And that is a mutual learning process. We are more also in middle-income countries. I've found more and more that we are actually learners as well as doers, and it is a mutual exchange. So in many cases, I think the public servants in the Philippines are actually extremely highly educated. And if you go to one of the Philippines meeting, actually you think you're sitting in a UN meeting, because they actually use all the UN jargon even better than us to a certain extent. And so you have to be very, up on your scale of even your own jargon if you want to really be making sense in those meetings. And so middle-income context is very important, and you have to really absorb that within yourself to be able to then do good work on institutional level, and which is sustainable. I think that about a year back, there was a very interesting article in the Financial Times on policy-based evidence versus evidence-based policy. And we know that, we all want evidence-based policy. But the fact is that the political world also works on policy-based evidence, where you actually know that political representatives want something done, and then evidence will come because that work needs to get done. And, actual work actually happens somewhere in between these two. you need to compromise to a certain extent with, if you want to really have serious political interest in your work, to be able to work, how do you really want to pitch that in cases to balance this off? Because of course, politicians will always have political interest to work on. And it's not good to completely ignore that if you want to build evidence into that. And it's actually a cumulative process. And the last thing I think I have already said, is accountability good for politics? And I think in some cases, yes. I would hope that that's how it's going to be. If you really want to save the world from what is happening actually across the world nowadays. And so I do want to stress the fact that that the whole work of capacity building has to be contextualized. It has to be done at several different levels, and we should not think of training as the only thing that we do in capacity development. And I would rather hear from, your name skips me, but in any case, Shiv Kumar. I would love to hear from Shiv Kumar some of the things that Amartya Sen has brought up in the context of development. One of the things that we have done in the Philippines, and I forgot to mention it, is to base our country program on some of the work that he has done on development as freedom. And just to put this in context, our development work deals with the freedom from want, and our risk mitigation works deals with freedom from fear, which is a very major issue in the Philippines, both in terms of its cultural aspects to accountability and also in terms of the human security issues that I have mentioned. So that's where I will stop. Thank you.